Hello everyone, and welcome to the circulatory system, the blood vessels, and the heart. As you can see, I'm not going to be on the screen, so here's a nice illustration of me. Enjoy that. So we do want to go through the anatomy of the heart first and foremost, and then we'll get to some of the other vessels in the body that I want you to know. So starting with the heart, I want you to remember that anything in red is typically going to be an artery. And anything in blue, sorry, it took me a second to get that little blue marker, is going to be a vein. This is going to go for most everything except for two things. And if you've seen the lecture video, you know what those two things are. So when you see red and blue, one of the big differences of red and blue is that red is going to contain highly oxygenated blood, and blue is going to contain low oxygenated blood. That is what it's referring to. But for the most part, when we're looking at the arteries and veins of the body, aside from two examples in the heart, it's going to be arteries are red and veins are blue. But all that's saying is the type of blood that is being contained inside of those vessels. So starting with the chambers of the heart, I want you to make a note of the right atrium here. This is also a structure known as the right auricle. And you are also going to contain one on the left side here. So just make sure you know that that is the left auricle. Right auricle, left auricle. And what the auricles are covering are the right and left atrium. Remember that when we are looking at a model, this is the model's right and left, not your right and left. So this is their right side and this is their left side. So this is how the heart would be sitting in your chest from your perspective, if that makes sense. So coming into the right atrium over here, we have the superior vena cava, and it's going to bring blood into that chamber. What you can't see on the back side of this heart, which I believe is on the next slide, is going to be the inferior vena cava. Remember, those are veins. Veins bring blood to the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Keep that in mind. So we have the superior and inferior vena cava. Inferior would be coming up from down here, going into this right atrium. From the right atrium, blood is going to go into the right ventricle. So the right ventricle is going to be this area here, and as you can see, this model is going to come apart, so be ready for that. From the right ventricle, blood is going to come up and go through into the pulmonary trunk. You'll notice that the pulmonary trunk is blue, right? And that is because it has low oxygen. This is one of the examples where you have low oxygen in an artery. Remember? And from there, the blood coming up into the pulmonary trunk is going to go into the left and also the right pulmonary arteries. So the pulmonary trunk separates into the left and right pulmonary arteries, where they are going to then go into the lungs. So there's a lung on either side of your chest, in case you didn't know. From your lungs, the blood is going to become oxygenated and come back to the heart through these little guys, and I believe the name's going to be on the next slide, but remember that is going to be the pulmonary veins. So just kind of wait to write that down on the next slide. It should be a little easier. From there, this blood is going to go into this chamber, the left atrium. From the left atrium, we are going to enter into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, we're going to kind of come up and underneath the pulmonary trunk and go into the aorta. So this very big vessel right here. And it's incredibly important. If this was ever to be severed, you would die within seconds because there is so much blood going through this structure at any given point in time. The top of the aorta is going to have 3 little arteries, they're not so little, coming off of it that are going to go to very specific places, and the names of these vessels are going to kind of tell you where it's going. So this first one here is the Brachiocephalic artery. The brachiocephalic, if you break down this term, is going to be the arm and the head. So this is going to go over to the right side of the body as well as up to the head. Likewise, the left common carotid is going to go up to the head as well and up through the neck. And then you have the left subclavian, so this is going to go to the left side of the body and kind of your left arm if you want to think of it that way. You do have a few vessels that are seen here that are coronary vessels. So you have the left coronary artery, this guy right here. This term, the interventricular sulcus, is just talking about this area here, right in the middle of the heart. It's kind of a little lower portion of the heart, which is just sort of separating our chambers here. So that's all it's talking about. A sulcus is usually like a little depression or like a little sunken in area, and that's all that's referring to. And then the last thing that we haven't talked about is the right coronary artery. So that is going to be over here. So looking at a posterior part of the heart or view of the heart, you can see a lot of things that we were looking at before, but this is showing this back portion, and that is showing the inferior vena cava and the right and left pulmonary veins. And you might be thinking, okay, but Rachel, you said that this side was right and this side was left. Well, we've turned the heart around and we're looking at it from the back. So that means that this is now the left side and this is now the right side. So kind of keep that in mind when you are changing how you view things. If you move them around, you're still going to see the right and left as it should be sitting in the model, but those things can kind of change around depending on how you're viewing it. All right, so opening up our heart here, we can see our different valves. We can still see these various chambers. And remember, this is an anterior view, so keep that in mind. I'm going to start over here in the bottom because I kind of like these to start off with. These are going to be the layers of the heart. And with this particular model, which I quite like, you can see all those layers, and I do talk about the layers more in your lecture. For this, I just want you to know it as it is, the anatomy of the layers of the heart. Make sure you know that endo is on the inside, the myocardium is going to be the muscle, and the epicardium is the outside. So back to the inside of our heart, we're looking at the valves and the various chambers. So what's nice about this model is that you can pretty easily see the various chambers here aside from the atria. The atria are up in this area and up in this area. I know it's kind of hard to visualize, but there is this little chamber up here kind of hidden in this model. But just kind of keep in mind that these chambers are up in there, and we are seeing the valves between the atria and the ventricle. Right now, we're kind of looking more at the ventricles than we are the atria. I know I kind of keep repeating that, but I want to make sure you get what I'm saying. So we see these ventricles down here, and we see the valves separating them. So first, between the right atrium and the right ventricle is the tricuspid valve. Between the left atrium and the left ventricle is the bicuspid valve. Separating our ventricles is going to be the interventricular septum. So that is just this little wall separating our ventricles. This does have a hole in it. Well, not this one specific, but the one separating your atria is going to have a hole in it when you're a fetus. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more when we move on to development. But just kind of, I don't know, make a little note in the back of your mind that there is a hole between your atria when you are a fetus. Within the ventricles, you're going to have something called papillary muscles. These papillary muscles are going to be these little projections here, kind of in the inferior portion of the ventricle, and they are going to attach to these strings coming down from the valves, the atrioventricular valves. These strings are called chordae tendineae, and remember, when they are relaxed or contracted, it's going to open or close the valves between the atria and the ventricles. So these are very, very important. Separating our ventricles from the primary vessels that they go to, such as the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, are going to be these fantastic semilunar valves. And that is the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve, respectively. Here we have our different white blood cells and kind of blood cells in general. I do talk about these more in the lecture, so from this slide, I want you to just kind of make a note of what they look like, write them down. Obviously, the colors are kind of different for each white blood cell to kind of help distinguish them. Some of their sizes are slightly different, and you can kind of see that a little bit better on the next slide when it goes through the next round of white blood cells. The two that look kind of funky and different, at least apart from the others, is going to be platelets and erythrocytes. So remember, platelets are going to help with clotting. They're also cell fragments that are going to clump together in order to form a clot. Erythrocytes are just red blood cells. And you can call them either. If you want to really impress me, you can write erythrocyte, but I'm also fine if you write red blood cell. What I was thinking of as I was saying that is I don't want you to put white blood cell when I say, what is this? And it's one of the white blood cells. You need to tell me basophil, neutrophil, lymphocyte, monocyte, etc. Now I said there was kind of a size difference, and I was referring to monocytes. Monocytes are enormous. You don't have a whole lot in your body at any given point in time, but they are really quite large compared to the other formed elements, which, remember, these are all formed elements. They are quite large. All right, moving into the arteries and veins of the chest. Again, kind of remember that when it comes to these structures, aside from the ones going from the heart to the lungs and from the lungs back to the heart, typically in red, you're going to have arteries. Aside from the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary artery, well, left and right pulmonary arteries, because you have one over here. Those are going to be in blue because that's low oxygen, but for the most part, arteries are going to have high oxygen. And if you didn't guess, most of these names are going to be anatomically where they're going to, potentially like where they are, where they're coming from sometimes, or, you know, etc., where they are in the body. For example, the right axillary artery is an artery found in your armpit, because axillary means armpit. Brachiocephalic just means head and arm, well, arm and head, so brachio and cephalic. And I think you guys can probably just write these down as you go. If you want to pause this slide and write them down, that's perfectly fine. I'm not going to go over every single one because it would just be me reading to you. But these are all of the arteries in this chest area that I want you to know. So here we have the veins. Again, most of them are going to be in blue, except for the left and right pulmonary veins. Those are going to be in red because, again, they are still veins, but they are carrying highly oxygenated blood, and most veins are going to hold low oxygenated blood. So kind of just keep that in mind. And if you want to pause this slide here, I would suggest doing that. This slide is showing us something a little bit different. This is the abdomen. So you have something called the abdominal aorta, this guy right here, and that is just this descending aorta going down into the abdomen. So you still have an aorta in your abdomen. I remember reading about a football player, and my boyfriend at the time was telling me about him as well, where he was injured, I believe, on the field, and it caused his aorta to break. Well, aortas, if you're talking about the aorta up by the heart, if that broke, tore, was ruptured, you would die in seconds, as I stated before. This particular football player, without being told it was the aorta, unlike it had to have been the abdominal aorta. Because if this one is severed, chances are you have a little bit higher chance of surviving than if it was the aorta by your heart. Again, this slide is showing mostly arteries, again in red, so kind of keep that in mind. If you would like to pause it right now, that would be a good thing to do. And the only thing I'm going to explain is probably this term hepatic. Hepatic is just referring to the liver, which this is the liver right here. And the term renal is going to refer to your kidneys. So liver and kidneys. And hopefully you remember what gonadal means. Gonads, or the testes or ovaries. This is showing the veins, so low oxygen, of the lower body. So we see that inferior vena cava, and this is going to be carrying blood up to the heart, while, remember, this descending aorta is bringing blood down. So kind of an important thing to make sure you know, that arteries are carrying blood away from the heart and veins are going to be bringing blood back to the heart. Here is a little bit more of a view of the neck and chest. If you'd like to pause it, now is a great time to do that in order to write everything out. This is a closer view of the abdomen and also on a different model. This model is showing arteries on the muscle man model. I really like this because it is anatomically relevant in size, and also it's showing a specific artery that I want you to kind of make note of, and that is the radial artery up here. When you think of the radial artery, I want you to think the artery that is closest to your thumb. And if you can right now, what I want you to do is to take your left hand, touch that bone that's just kind of right between your thumb and your wrist. It kind of makes up most of your wrist. And I want you to move down and try to find your radial artery with 2 fingers. So your pointer finger and your middle finger, and you should be able to find your pulse. You have a few different pulse points in your body. At your temple on both sides, you have the radial artery, your elbow, but on the inside of your elbow, not the outside. You have a pulse point in your groin, as well as at your knee, and also in a similar spot from your wrist, but on your ankle. So I do want you to be able to find your radial artery. I think it's interesting and important to be able to find. If you can find it on yourself, typically you can find it on somebody else. A lot of people use the pulse point that's on their neck, but sometimes it's a lot harder to find. So it's a little easier to find it on your wrist. But that concludes the lab portion. And feel free to go back and pause at any spot where you may have missed something.